Hello and welcome to today's panel, How Businesses and Government Need to Adapt to Consumer Ownership of Data. My name is Reiser. I'm the Head of Business Development for KABN, a company developing tools that will help users take control of their online identity. We have a really exciting panel for you today. We have four perspectives. We have a user, technology, an investor, and government that will all chime in on our control of data and online identity. Today we have Senator Colin, Deacon, a successful entrepreneur and ran several global businesses. In 2018, he was appointed to the Senate of Canada from Nova Scotia. Now as Senator, he's a champion for the digital economy, open banking, and Canada's privacy legislation. We also have Milan Patel. He's a product manager, IBM Security. Milan is focused on delivering identity, access solutions for a multi-cloud world in emerging innovative areas. IBM is leading the industry in driving standards and open source technology in support of trusted digital identity. We also have Ben Kessler, CEO of KABN. Ben has held high-level positions at MasterCard, American Express, and numerous other banks. He is now focused on an application that provides users the ability to verify their online identity as easy as they did at the banks that he ran. Radhika Iyengar is a serial entrepreneur and founder partner at StarChain Ventures, a Silicon Valley-based venture studio focused on the convergence of advanced technologies, blockchain, AI, machine learning, Internet of Things. She is an enterprise blockchain expert, and she just released a book and a sought after speaking on blockchain, healthcare, and digital identity. Welcome, panelists. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off. We don't have very much time. We have 30 minutes. At the end of this panel, I want all of our listeners to have an understanding of what digital identity is and controlling their data online means. So I'm going to kick the first one off to Ben, who represents the user community. What is ownership of data, and how does that affect digital identity? What is the difference? What is different than the consumer's view in the use, excuse me, how is it different than the way consumers view and use identity today? Ben?
Great. Well, thank you, RJ, and good to be speakers. In terms of our startup, we see digital identity as a basic human right. But really, it's all about how you prove you are you online. And today, it's sort of viewed as an intangible. So if you take a look, we always like to go back to the real world versus the online world. And in the real world, you have a wallet and you have a key ring. The wallet holds your digital ID, your identification. It holds certain items and pieces of information that you hold dear. In terms of a key ring will have keys that will give you access to an office, your car, or your home. And so I think you have to start thinking about the differences of what that means in real world versus the online world. And with respect to digital identity and the personal data that comes with it, you have to start looking at how you can, in the same way that you have these real world face-to-face transactions and experiences, how do you emulate that in the digital world? How do you manage and control your ID and your personal data online?
Great, thanks, Ben. So I'm going to throw a question over to Milan. So you guys have done lots of research creating standards for the industry. So as you look at the evolution of digital identity models that are used today, who are the key stakeholders, and centralized, federated versus decentralized, and the shifts of control from organizations to consumers?
So as we started to play off Ben's comments, right, as we started shifting and looking at mediums from physical world interactions to digital interactions, the layer of identity on the internet wasn't necessarily thought through as we've started the genesis of our digital relationships and interactions. So we started out with centralized models, right? And when we think of identity in general, we've always used standards as the route to be able to do that in an interoperable, scalable way, right? So we've introduced things like HTTPS, TLS as a set of standards to be able to do it in the context of a centralized approach. As we expanded that, we've realized that the point-to-point relationships that we have just become inundated for end users. So we try to advance that to see how do we make it a better experience for end users to interact from an identity standpoint digitally, right? So we've introduced this notion of federation, where we allow users to federate between various parties, right? And in the context of identity, right, you've got issuers, end users, and verifiers, right? Identity providers, users, and relying parties. With the notion of federation, we've reduced the number of usernames and passwords that users have, but we did it through a standardized ways, right? Like SAML, OpenID Connect, and OAuth. As we look to move the spectrum from ownership of identity from organizations and move it to users, this new emerging standard-based way of doing it with decentralized identity is emerging. And just like its previous predecessors of federation and centralized models, it's also rooted in standards, right? And the standards in this model are in the context of decentralized identifiers, verifiable credentials, which are both, by the way, specifications in the World Wide Web Consortium, as well as DKMS, decentralized key management, which again is in the context of OASIS. All of these existing organizations that are looking for these next evolution of standards to then drive these experiences between issuers, holders, and verifiers to make it privacy by design and user controlled, are all organizations that have done previous identity standards. So it's really an evolution of the spectrum of user control and moving the control from organizations to end users.
That's great. So we have where now the old ways of doing business online is changing, and we have the technology like you just mentioned where we can actually have the tools now where you can control your identity, associated data, and control your data that's associated with your identity. Now for Radhika, from an investor perspective, with that scenario being played out, what excites you most in the investors that you work with and talk to? What excites you and them most about the digital identity opportunity, and where do you see the challenges with this whole new infrastructure?
So just a small correction. I'm heading up a venture studio, which is slightly different from a classic venture capital firm. So just want to kind of clarify on that point. So we're actually in the process of spinning up new companies, and that the thesis still remains. And so the excitement about something like digital identity is that it's really, if you think about the whole movement that we're in adoption of blockchain, we're really in a three-phase sort of approach. The first phase has all been about redefining trust, and it's the internet of trust. And then the next phase, if you will, these are not like clear, in serial fashion kind of phases that I'm talking about, but the waves of adoption. If you think about the next phase, that's going to be really focused on the internet of value. And then the third wave, if you will, is going to be the internet of identity. And why is that going to be sort of at that culmination point? Well, number one, it's going to have to depend on a lot of other components adopted along the way, prepping the way and easing the on-ramp for something like digital identity, which is rather complex, to be scalably deployed. So if you look at from an investment lens, it really is about building things that are scalable, right? So this is not a one-off thing. This is not a happenstance thing. It's something that's going to be pervasive. It's going to be persistent. It's going to be a part of our lives, right? And so, Ben, you talked about a digital wallet and a key ring, or a wallet and a key ring in the physical world. And you look at the online digital world, you really are looking at something as foundational as digital identity being that important, but also that complex, because human beings are not unidimensional. We are multidimensional. We have multiple identities. From a credentialing standpoint, Milan, you brought up the whole subject of verifiability. That comes down to credentials, right? And so you can have a financial credential, you can have a legal credential, you can have a health record credential, you can have multiple types of credential, even perhaps even a social credential or a professional credential. So there are a number of different credentials that are going to be needing to be expressed through this wallet of sorts. And so the investment community is looking at something like digital identity. Those of us that are believers really do believe that that digital identity has to encompass all of these different facets of who we are. And so that's not an easy thing to accomplish. So this is something that's going to be a longer term play from that perspective, but I think it's a huge growth opportunity space. And then when you think about credentials, we can't escape the fact, and this is going to cue to you, hopefully, Colin, the government plays a key role in this process, because if government and other issuing bodies. So, you know, the question of who's issuing that credential? What's the source of that? Is it secure? Is it reliable? Is it verified? But then from the user standpoint, it has to come down to individual control. So the concept of self-sovereign identity, for example, is one of those approaches that is exciting, particularly from that investment standpoint, because it really changes the dialogue between users and businesses and government or other issuing bodies, for example. So there's an interplay and an ecosystem play of stakeholders. Someone issues a credential, someone uses that credential, someone verifies the credential, someone, you know, authenticates that credential, and it has to be from an individual control standpoint. What we're looking at is all the different use cases where we would say users have that control and access to their own identity throughout their time and can use it and share only what they need to share, by the way, not everything. So from a use case standpoint, we'll get into more of that from an investment lens, what is exciting out there in the landscape. But you can talk about things even from a government standpoint, issuing licenses, for example, a passport or those kinds of documents. But you can also talk about health records. You can talk about licenses. You can talk about educational credentials, workplace credentials that need to be verified, all manner of use cases. So these are the kinds of areas that we're looking at.
Great. Now, you mentioned scalable. Do you believe the technology is at that point to meet the requirements for scalability?
I think it's not, you know, it is getting to that point where certain things have been proven to be scalable. So identity in the case of, say, trust your supplier, and Milan, maybe you want to expound more on that. But trust your supplier is one mechanism. It's a network of different participants where suppliers' identities are being secured on the blockchain and digital identity is very much a part of that. And so proving who you are in that chain so everybody can see and it's all transparent and auditable, that's something that is being deployed. Is it the case that we all have our, I don't know, driver's license and records on a blockchain? We aren't there yet. Is it the case that we have our health records tied to this digital identity that is secured by the blockchain? We aren't there yet. So when we talk about scalability, let's remember that in each sector is going to have its own rate of adoption. And we are seeing the applications of identity already cropping up in numerous areas, but in terms of scalability, it's also going to come down to, especially where consumers are concerned, the interplay between well, it's hybrid systems is really what we're looking at. So on the back end, you might have an enterprise permission system, but on the front end, you might have a permissionless system. And so that interplay between those two systems and those hybrid systems are things that are just coming up. So I don't yet see it at the point, and that's why I said this internet of identity is a little bit further down in time. Does that mean that we don't work on it right now? Absolutely not. It means that we do work on it now, knowing full well that the on-ramp is going to extend out into the next few years.
Milan, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that? I know that you had a...
Yeah, I do. I think so. There's maybe two things there. I think Radhika is sort of right on, right? And when she talks about really what we're doing with this decentralized identity aspect, like any metadata representation of an individual, organization, or thing becomes the foundation of a credential and an attribute exchange, right? At the end of the day, what we call it in IBM is this reputation economy, right? Everything is going to have a reputation. It's going to be based on the credentials that you obtain and then present. To the comments on the scalability. Scalability is just one dimension really to bring things to fruition, right? You can have as much scale as you want, but at the end of the day, if there's no interoperability between networks, the scalability really is diluted in the fact of the value that it provides, right? Because at the end of the day, regardless of what utility you anchor to, who you obtain credentials from, you should be able to present it. Like, this wallet has credentials in it. I take my driver's license wherever I want, right? And that's the level of interoperability we need in conjunction with scalability to make things reality, right? And scalability is just one dimension, yes, but it's got to be in the context of the broader use of that credential to really bring things to value, right? So a lot of that is still being worked in the open, and that's the big thing, is working it in the open so that you have that interoperability foundation from a community standpoint.
Great. Let's move on. A quick question for you, Senator. As digital identity moves towards more consumer control and ownership of data, what is the role of government, and where does government see the strongest use cases in the future?
I think government is just catching on to its role in Canada, to be honest. We've got one province that moved on digital identity early on, that was Alberta. But we haven't got a national framework. It's emerging, and I think by the end of the year could be in place. But it's a national framework, because we've got a confederation that has a lot of authority in the provinces and as well as the federal government. But for me, the role of the government is very clear. This is foundational to productivity. If we do not provide individuals the ability to control their digital identity and have the interoperability that allows us to our companies and organizations and our governments to work effectively and efficiently globally, and the ability to have data portability easily, that allows individuals to be able to control who uses their data, for what purposes, for how long, and based on consumer data rights. I loved last year on August 1st, the Senate in Australia passed the Consumer Data Rights Act. But that act, the basis of it emerged from the Australian Productivity Commission. So for me, it is the foundation of how we're going to function going forward. It's essential to providing individuals with self-sovereignty and control over the data streams that come off of their lives on a minute-by-minute, second-by-second basis, and how those data are used and how they get to use them and access them at any point in time. So this is, for me, this is central to virtually every social and economic aspect of an economy, and it's why I'm really interested in it. But at this point, to take advantage of the opportunities in digital government, to take opportunities in open banking, Canada has been lagging, and we've got to really start to accelerate and put focus on this issue.
So another quick question for you, Senator. Do you find yourself that you have to do more education amongst all your colleagues, or is it more brainstorming on solutions and a direction forward?
I've been spending a lot of time learning on these topics and trying to have my colleagues in who have different areas of interest to understand how this intersects with their priorities. And so for me, that's, even as it relates, for example, to refugees, imagine if someone is having to leave everything behind in a war-torn country, but they could still access their crucial documents and have safe, secure digital access to their most crucial documents. There's applications throughout every area of interest. And so that's where I'm trying to focus at this point in time, because it has to become a national priority in order for us to really move ahead as an economy and as a society.
I really appreciate your perspective, and I really enjoy the support that you give to the community out here and to all the businesses that are trying to solve these problems. So thank you very much. Let me continue on, and let's go right to the regulations. So this is more like an open question to all of our panelists here. And it's all about, now kind of take a step back. We talked about the technology. We talked about how it kind of fits together. Now let's take a step back and look at regulations. So the advancements of the digital economy and the need to protect consumer ownership of data has sparked a movement of new data policies. So we have GDPR, we have the CCPA. In Canada, we have the PIPEDA. Does it go far enough to protect consumer rights and data ownership in the modern times?
I'd love to jump in there.
Perfect.
And I'll hand it over to the experts in a second, but I can tell you that in Canada, we are desperately in need of an update to PIPEDA. We need to have data portability so that consumers can actually have control over their data and how it's used and by whom, in order to not just protect the consumer, but to protect new entrants into any market. Incumbents can have a very, very powerful position and position of control if consumers are not given the authority to control their data streams. So for me, it's central for us as an economy to update our privacy legislation, and I think that certainly the government has indicated that they've got that on their agenda. It was interrupted by COVID, but it is something that's coming.
Yeah, I totally 100% agree. I think that where I would add is that you can have governments around the globe in terms of different jurisdictions putting regulations in place to protect consumers. You can have the technology, but that third leg of the stool is the actual consumers. You have to change that behavior. You have to get the adoption, because I think we've all been conditioned to believe that the internet is anonymous. We've been conditioned, and in some ways, theoretically, people know in the last couple of years that large enterprises are mining and profiling their data to those entities' benefit. And I think a lot of people have sort of theoretically said that should change, I should benefit, I should manage and control my identity and my personal data. But I think we're still a ways off from actually, in practice, getting that done. And so I think that third leg of the stool is really how do we continue to push and sort of push on consumers heading down that direction. And the last point I'd make is that I think it becomes increasingly important in the current macro environment where people are spending a significant amount of their lives online, whether it's for work, pleasure, education, what have you.
Can I just jump in there and add to what my colleagues here have said on the panel? Absolutely correct. A lot needs to be done, but I think this is where the ecosystem play really comes in, and we need all stakeholders to be a part of this conversation. So on the regulation front, we absolutely need government as a partner in this, because they will set the legislative framework, and that needs to happen, absolutely. And then you talk about user adoption. For me, it comes down to that user experience and UI, right? It has to be something that is seamless, that we don't think about when we're doing. With the advent of something like the smartphone, everything moved to mobile, right? I mean, remember the days when we sat with a computer and we say, am I really going to put in all of my information like online? I'm going to make this purchase? My God, what's going to happen, right? There was a sense of trepidation, right, from a consumer standpoint. So it's building trust with the consumer. And when you think about scalable solutions. These are the things we think about, saying, how is somebody going to have the trust to make that leap, right? And so there are waves of adoption that have to happen in any emerging technology. So whether you're talking about the internet at large, whether you're talking about mobile and e-commerce and what that means on a mobile platform. And remember when we took out our smartphones saying, I'm going to actually now put my credentials on this thing and it's actually going to be secure. So there's a lot that needs to be proven. And so privacy, security, digital identity, these are just facets of the very same thing we're talking about, because it actually happens to be about us, right? And we have to interact with entities, with businesses, with merchants, with governments, right? And so this portability aspect that you brought up, Colin, is very apropos, because from a user experience standpoint, you need that to be, and this is why the DIDs come in, because you really need it to be something portable, something private, something persistent, right? And these are the three aspects of DIDs that are going to have to be integrally woven into whatever mechanism we come up with, whether it's an app on your phone or another type of digital document or a wallet, a digital wallet of sorts. Whatever that mechanism is to facilitate that interaction, it's going to have to come down to usability and user experience.
Yeah, can I just add, I'm sorry to jump in, RJ, but that, again, awesome. We're all aligned and this has not been scripted, but I do think in terms of that, it really comes down to making digital identity tangible for the average user. So portability, scalability, all of those pieces, but it's really to the user experience. People have a hard time grasping something that's not tangible. So I totally agree with what you've said.
And I'd offer one more point, Ben, is that's key to the adoption of any technology. You've got to deliver value. And
Right.
What is the value to the citizen? What is the value to the consumer? How does it improve their life? And if that isn't really strong in a new emerging technology, then you're not going to be able to get the adoption levels that are required to make it sustainable. So for me, those use cases that Radhika has just been speaking about are crucial in the early stages to make sure that we really understand those and we use those as opportunities to test the frameworks we develop legislatively and from a regulatory standpoint, and be prepared to iterate. This is, taking the lessons learned from startups and bringing it into the legislative process is, I think, really crucial at this stage in order to make sure that we optimize the opportunity. Thanks.
Yeah, great. This is.
Could I add something to
Yeah.
what Colin just said? The urgency of government getting involved in this. I couldn't agree more. So I wear a couple of different hats. One of my hats is as a member of the California GovOps Blockchain Working Group, which was formed as a task force, so to speak, to advise California State Legislature and the governor on what they should be thinking about, right? Really, what are the implications of this technology? What are the use cases? And one of the pilots that we recommended among the multitudes of things that we considered was actually the DMV, driver's license, right? And we looked at that and we said, that's something that we think can actually be something where California legislature can think about and moving that to a digital world associated with digital identity. So this was one of the areas that we said, there are things about healthcare, for example, that you can talk about, but that's a little bit more complex. So might have to wait a while on that. But I do think that something as what we think is basic as a driver's license, where it's the Department of Motor Vehicles issuing a license that authorizes you to drive a vehicle. But that digital ID now becomes something where now you're using that. Milan, you pointed to your wallet, your physical wallet, and saying, I'm going to fill out my license to prove who I am, right? But do they need to know where I live? Do they need to know my height and weight and eye color and whatever else is on there? They don't. They just need to know that I'm of a certain age, perhaps. They need to know that I am who I say I am. So these are the things, and preventing fraud, right? In people taking advantage of that system. system. So these are the things that I feel like it's really going to have to come together, where government is going to play a central role in that deployment, and really back the deployment of something like this. But then also, I think on the startup side, offering innovative ways to make the user experience seamless so that we can drive adoption through that.
You're so right. So we're starting to run out of time. I have a million questions. I wish I could add more time, but I'm going to cherry pick some of these final questions here. So just to kind of add on to what you're referring to, it is going to take all of the different communities that we have in this panel today to come together, create the standards, and the usability and the value. So as we implement this digital ID, it will require the coordination between large numbers and range of stockholders, governments, regulators, associations, banks, financial institutions. And I know that we're focused on an identity framework, right? What are the risks of not having that framework? And then also, any advice that you have where we can all really come together and work to come up with this encompassing solution that builds on trust. And I know, I guess I kind of threw it out to everybody. Who wants to go first? Anyone?
I can go first. So, so as we think about sort of the evolution, right? Like we've started out with pockets. Think about the internet. Like it started with universities, right? And each of it just to exchange books, and everyone had their own implementation. Then we sort of fast forwarded, and I guess to date myself, I haven't really experienced it. Like the internet, the genesis of that was before I was able to use it, but I did my research on it. But then we sort of came to this notion of just one single internet. Like we don't think about things like DNS servers or anything like that, right? At the end of the day, it's just resolvable. And before you would have to have specific browsers that go to specific websites, right? And now just everything just is portable, works. The reason for that is because of the promise and the frameworks that everyone put into it. And it's not like it happened overnight, right? So to Radhika's point on starting with the driver's license, like that's a good starting point. But at the end of the day, that has a specification, and there's a NIST specification for a mobile driver's license. Some people are very focused on just that without necessarily looking at it in the context of that's just one type of credential, right? And it needs to be put in the context of how we look at this should be credential agnostic, but should allow for the specificity that you need to as you rely and provide those, right? In terms of verification and holding and storing and management of that. So when we think about all that coming together, we've alluded to in the last question, right? It doesn't take just the technology. It takes business and legal, like the quintessential BLT to make anything really come to reality. And at the end of the day, it starts with defining that framework. We're involved very, very passionately in the open, right? Anything that we do isn't proprietary, right? We try to do it as open as possible because at the end of the day, it's a collective effort that makes it happen. Just think about the genesis of the internet. It's going to take that level of standard specification and adoption to really make some of this come to reality, in which business and legal need to equally be considered in conjunction with the technology.
I'll just say that it's beyond just the business and legal and the technology. It also is public-private. So I think I'd like to think about, and I think Colin, you can absolutely speak more on this, but I think it's that public-private partnership that's really going to drive greatest adoption. It is in the interest of government to ensure that its citizens or its residents of a state are going to be compliant. We absolutely, you asked RJ about what if we didn't do it right? Well, that's another bad Pandora's box, right? We don't want to get into that. Frameworks and standards are so important because it makes sure that we're all on the same page. And so I think that standards bodies, are going to be essential in this. Governance frameworks are going to be very, very key to this. But I think it's that public-private partnership that I'm really excited to see, and how we're going to shape this. And I think the internet enjoyed some of that too, albeit it was, it had its safe harbors, right? And when it was first deployed. But if you think about what propelled, for example, the internet, Milan, you talked about universities. Step before that, it was government. It was defense, the Department of Defense, that funded a lot of that work. And so we absolutely need that seed, if you will, with the push of government, because it also legitimizes the entire effort. So I think that from a citizen standpoint and from a resident standpoint, and wanting to do the right thing, when you talk about consumer adoption, particularly when it comes to something as sensitive as digital identity, we have to have it legitimized. And the only entity, in my opinion, that can truly legitimize something like this is government.
Well, and I'd agree firmly, but I think government's got to get it right in the early stages, because it can slow the process down by not fully understanding its role, and its role is in partnership, as you just said, and where can we deliver the greatest value soonest to citizens, so they start to say, oh, I get this. This is how my life is improved. And then all of a sudden they go to every different organization they're dealing with and start to say, you don't do it this way? Why don't you do it this way? And to me, that's crucial. We've got to be really smart about it. We can't just put the frameworks in place and walk away. We've got to make sure that we get those early applications that act as a beachhead to enable us to then start to broaden out into the wider economy. And the only way to do that, in my mind, is to work in partnership with all aspects of our economy, and start to really make sure that we've found the right starting points, and that we've got a framework that will allow us to scale into the broader economy, and a way of dealing with it that can iterate. And I just want to finish with one last point, is that I think that the role of standard setting organizations in the world we're in today is going to be crucial in starting to drive our development of regulation and legislation, because standard setting bodies bring together a multitude of perspectives that, if we can start to utilize them in a really really tangible way, I think they're going to be a tremendous help in us updating and keeping our regulations up to date, and allowing for a productive and globally competitive economy to exist. So for me, I'm a big fan of those standard setting bodies. CIO Strategy Council in Canada, for example, around digital IDs, played a crucial role and actually filled a void that was left by government not acting. So thanks very much for that.
Absolutely. Ben, did you want to add anything on that as we kind of come to an end here?
No, I think. Look, the Senator, Radhika, everyone has said it perfectly. I can't really add anything, with the exception of, I think in terms of how we all benefit, is when the consumer user is really able to truly manage, control, and benefit from their digital identity and their personal data. And I think it was Radhika who said it is a long game. But so we know the finish. What we have to do right now is sort of manage that middle while we're getting there to get to the end. And you, all of the points made today, totally agree with all of them.
This has been a great panel, great perspective from all the different angles that you guys have. Thank you very much for your time. And for the listeners out there, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. Thank you very much, everybody.